they start enjoying it, and they see that what they thought was true. So we come into the early stages of being an adult, or I don't know, a Lily person here. I don't know. I don't know where adulthood starts. So not there. So we see here that they're still fighting against it, and they're trying to push up. They're like, no, I mean, I'm still working. I've got a job. I'm not retired. And so they do all these things to try and feel younger. And we're going to get into, Dr. Talley will talk about this in relation to concealable stigmas. But, come on. There we go. So substituting smiley faces for frowny faces. The first thing they suggest is to challenge our beliefs. So some of the research has had the elderly look at their lives and examine how many times do we see these stereotypes in a day. So that's part of the thing they say is recognizing. That's what the last thing was. We watch TV, it's there. We're driving, we see other people act differently. In our conversations at the doctor, our conversations with family, with friends. And we'll become aware of just how common it is, and they encourage you to challenge this belief because it's not true for most people. And they say to accentuate the positives and finally to increase the variability of what it means to be old. And let's see, where do we go next? Yeah, so we're talking about moving from this category over to this category. So when they divided the elderly up into grandma or person at church or any of these other elderly categories, they found a lot more positive things about them. And that's kind of the same thing that they've seen happen for other ones. If we look here, typically, African Americans are going to fall over here. Yeah, right here. So we look at blacks, for example. When we split it between poor and the ones who work, like a more white-collar job, we see that they've shifted from low competence and low warmth up to high competence and high warmth. So when we take our categories and we diversify them, when we make them more than just old, when we make it more than just elderly, we're able to find these positive things. Come on. So they suggest finally, accept the good and the bad, but they've shown some research longitudinally, controlling for several variables. What they showed is that if you have a positive view on aging, you're going to live on average 7.5 years longer. That's a ton of time. And these are typically good years. They're active family. And the research suggests that this is moderated in part because these people don't take these negative stereotypes to heart. They think, well, so what if I'm old? I can still walk. I can still do whatever it is I want to do. And they find joy in that. And they're living an average of 7.5 years longer. So I think we're going to get into the research here. But what's motivating this in part, and I'll get to Dr. Talley in a second, is that in my own life I've seen several different aging patterns. We see, I just applied for a grant, so I had to put this in. And my grandpa, he's one of my heroes. He's a great man. He got a Purple Heart at Okinawa. He worked hard his entire life at a steel mill. He supported my dad and my aunt. He raised them well. He's got something like, I don't know, there's way too many grandkids and then great-grandkids. And so he's got this huge posterity. And he was active and healthy through his 93rd birthday, and then he sadly passed away a couple years ago. But when I saw my grandpa, I did not see Grandpa Simpson. I did not see the person in those birthday cards. I saw a man who was mowing his lawn every week until about a month before he passed away. Now, I saw a man who was always working. He built additions to our house. He was always there for us. He was a great man. And the contrast here made me recognize that there's different trajectories for aging. And we can, in large part, control how that is. So that's what we're trying to do here, is to find one, ways that we can stop people from having these stereotypes, and then two, what can we do to help people age better? So Dr. Talley is going to talk about some of that.
All right, thank you, David. So I'm going to talk about some projects that have been initiated in the lab recently in the past year. And as David was mentioning, we have this broad category of the elderly. And it's typically assumed that as soon as you label something, that all of the characteristics that are associated with that label immediately come to mind for that category. So, for example, the idea would be that if you were walking down the street and you saw another individual coming toward you who was an older person, that you would immediately think of all of the stereotypes and traits associated with an older person. So the stereotypes in our society, like weak, feeble, warm, friendly, those kinds of stereotype characteristics would automatically come to mind. At least that's how it was thought of previously. What subsequent research has shown is just because you can look at a person and label them with some kind of identity, Black, Christian, whatever identity you want to label them with, doesn't necessarily invoke the stereotypes in all situations. And so David noticed that this had only been looked at for race-based cues and gender-based cues. So he wanted to see if we could stop the activation of the elderly stereotype before it had a chance to leak out in very deleterious ways through pity, through extra helping that might not be warranted and things like that. So the goal was really to reduce their influence so that there were no kind of unintended downstream consequences. So there is a model by Bodenhausen and McCrae in the literature that describes how the stereotype process works, just generally speaking. So according to this model by McCrae and Bodenhausen, the first thing that happens is we see a category cue, okay? So we might see an individual and we might immediately categorize them, as we tend to do automatically. And associated with that is that activation of all the stereotypic traits that go along with that, okay? Bodenhausen and McCrae argued that you could either activate those stereotype cues, in which case they would flow down further in this process, or potentially if we inhibited the stereotypes from even being activated in the first place when people came upon a category cue, then we could stop this process and we wouldn't see these downstream consequences of biased interpretation of incoming information and also biased responses through behavioral discrimination, okay? So the idea was that generally if this process is going along as it tends to do, as soon as we categorize, we have our stereotype activated, right? In which case, then we go into the phase of personal control, which is when we can kind of thoughtfully reflect on what those stereotypic traits are and then decide either to accept them or reject them, right? As being true or untrue. So if we had our elderly stereotype activated, we can, through motivated reasoning, endorse those things as being true, or we can reject those things as being false, okay? And again, if we reject them, we don't see any further processing going on. If we endorse those stereotypic traits as being true, then we're more likely to end up in a discriminatory response, so that we are behaving in accord with what we believe or expect or assume about the people that we encounter. So David's idea was, if we can stop the stereotyping process of elderly individuals or older persons at this initial phase, then we don't have to worry about the downstream consequences of ageism and some of the negative things that go along with that. And if that's the case, we can stop the process there early on. So through some pretty clever methods, we are currently investigating this idea in the lab that we can stop these stereotypes from being activated before they become relevant to our behavior. One thing that David mentioned or talked about was this idea of a concealable stigma, an invisible stigma. Now you might initially think, I'm an older adult. People can tell that by looking at me, right? Because I appear as an older adult. But some of the things that go along with being an older adult, such as chronic health conditions, caregiver roles, some of those are more invisible, meaning people would not know about them unless you told them, right? So in general, in our society, we have this constant quest to appear younger, to be younger. So women are concerned with putting makeup on right so they look younger, more put together. They might even get Botox. They might work out, which is a healthy, adaptive way to feel younger. But for those things that affect us that are invisible, like the early stages of dementia, which aren't always apparent for people to pick up on, right? And for things like serving in a caregiver role for someone whose health might be failing, those are things that no one would know that they're affecting you unless you told them. So I had developed a theoretical model about what we can expect when we're concerned with protecting some of those stigmatized identities that we might hold, okay? So I'm going to walk you through this model, which I realize is very dense, but it's meant to cover a lot of possibilities, okay? So let's go ahead and focus right now on the top of this model, which is the idea that when you have a concealable stigma, and I'm going to go ahead and use one like being diagnosed with dementia, okay? So in the early stages of dementia, it might not be readily apparent to other people that you're struggling or being challenged by issues related to dementia. So as a consequence of knowing how others might devalue you if they learned that you had dementia, you become aware, acutely aware in different situations of how your behavior might be interpreted were you to be found out that you're having issues with memory loss, okay? So in a situation, you'll be consumed or concerned with leaking out clues that you might be dealing with this kind of stigmatized identity. And what we argue theoretically is that that preoccupation is going to affect your emotional regulation and also affect you cognitively. Well, why would that be? Because if you're constantly concerned in various situations about inadvertently disclosing when you didn't mean to that you're struggling with issues of dementia, that takes up part of your mind, right? That takes up part of your mental resources to constantly be monitoring and checking and interpreting. Well, I lost my keys this morning. Was that from the dementia, or was that just me and being forgetful about where my keys are, right? All of those kinds of cognitive processes take up our mental resources, so we end up engaging in a lot more self-focus, trying to interpret how, why we're behaving as we do, how others are interpreting what we're doing. And then this kind of impairs our ability to regulate our emotions and our self-control, is what we would argue. Going along with all these cognitive consequences are feelings of potentially hostility, from feeling that you're not completely understood, from feeling that no one quite gets your perspective, And so all of these negative emotions can go along with that. Now, according to this model, these cognitive and affective dysregulation, these things that occur, lead to impaired behavioral consequences. So we argue that these things can decrease your will to live, which increases risk of suicide in older adults. We argue that people who feel stigmatized because of a concealable identity might have more problems with alcohol and drug use, and potentially isolate themselves socially, because then they won't have to monitor who's finding out about their concealable stigmatized identity. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, all of this kind of depends on disclosure, right? If I'm very upfront with everyone and I just say what I'm feeling, you know, I went to the doctor last week and he said that I was diagnosed with dementia, and I'm kind of struggling with it right now, so I'd really appreciate it if you could talk with me about this. If you're disclosing, then that can alleviate a lot of these things from being of concern to you, because you don't have to monitor, and then you won't experience as much negative affect and lack of self-control. I won't get into these other moderating variables at this point, but there's other things that matter. For example, whether you expect that people are going to treat you differently if they find out. If you don't expect that, you don't have to worry about it, right? Another thing that might matter is how important it is to you to be seen as someone with a good memory. If you don't care that others devalue you because you sometimes forget things in the early stages of dementia, then it won't be as affecting you. It won't affect you as much. So David applied this model